Wren Hollowmere had scrubbed the same castle floors for 11 years, ever since she was brought in as an orphan child with no pack and no name that anyone bothered to remember. She grew up quietly, always in the background, always with a bucket in her hand or a rag over her shoulder. Nobody in the castle expected anything from her. Nobody thought she would ever matter. That is exactly why what happened later shocked everyone so much. The castle she worked in belonged to King Kael Ashveil, ruler of the Ashveil pack, one of the strongest wolf packs in the region. He was known across the land as a fair leader, strict but honest, strong but calm. He had fought in wars before he was even 20, and by the time he took the throne, most packs feared him and respected him in equal measure. For years, everyone assumed the king would marry someone from a noble bloodline, maybe the daughter of another alpha, maybe a warrior from a powerful pack, someone with status, someone with a strong wolf, someone the court could be proud of. Nobody expected him to choose the maid who cleaned the floors. But he did. It started on an ordinary evening. Wren was cleaning the east hallway, the same hallway she cleaned almost every day, humming softly to herself the way she always did when nobody was around to hear her. She didn't notice the king standing at the end of the hall, watching her. He wasn't watching her clean. He was watching her hum. It was such a small thing, a tune under her breath, nothing special, nothing rehearsed. But there was something about it, something honest, that caught his attention in a way nothing else in that castle ever had. In a place full of polished manners and careful smiles, here was someone who thought no one was looking, and who was, in that unwatched moment, simply herself. He didn't say anything to her that night, but he remembered it. Over the following weeks, he began noticing more. He noticed how she was the only servant who spoke kindly to the young stable boy who always got yelled at by the others. He noticed how she never joined the gossip in the kitchen, even when it would have been easy to. He noticed she worked harder than most nobles ever had to work in their whole lives, and never once complained. Slowly, without meaning to, the king found himself thinking about her more than he thought about anyone else. He didn't act on it right away. A king doesn't just walk up to a maid and announce his feelings. There were rules, expectations, a whole structure of pack tradition that made such a thing almost unthinkable. But the more time passed, the more he realized something simple and true. He respected her more than anyone else in his court, and respect, for him, mattered more than bloodline. So one evening, he asked her to walk with him in the garden. Wren almost dropped the bucket she was holding when the request came. A servant girl doesn't get invited to walk with the king. She thought at first it was some kind of mistake, or maybe a test, or maybe someone playing a cruel joke on her. But when she saw his face, she realized it was real. They walked together under the evening sky, saying very little at first. Kael was not a man of many words. Wren was not used to being asked her opinion on anything. But slowly, the silence became comfortable instead of awkward, and by the time they returned to the castle, something had shifted between them, quietly and without any fanfare. That night, Wren didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling of her small room, replaying the walk over and over, wondering what it meant, if it meant anything at all. It meant everything, because a few weeks later, King Kael stood in front of the entire pack council and made an announcement that shook the castle to its core. He was going to marry Wren Hollowmere. The room went silent for a moment, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then came the whispers, then came the stares, then slowly came the laughter, quiet at first, hidden behind hands and turned faces, but laughter all the same. Nobles who had spent years trying to arrange marriages between their daughters and the king now looked at each other with wide eyes and barely concealed smirks. Some openly scoffed, others simply shook their heads as if the king had lost his mind. The maid, someone whispered from the back of the hall. He's chosen the maid? She scrubs floors for a living, another voice muttered. What kind of queen will she make? Wren stood beside the throne, wearing a dress that had been quickly altered but still didn't quite fit her properly. She could feel every pair of eyes in that room, and none of them were kind. She kept her gaze fixed on a small stain on the ceiling, a mark shaped almost like a crown, because looking at that felt safer than looking at the crowd. Kael, however, did not flinch. He stood tall, his expression unreadable, and when the murmurs grew too loud, he simply said, "This is my decision. It is final." The council had no choice but to accept it, even if their faces made it clear they didn't agree with it. From that day forward, Wren's life changed completely, but not in the way people might expect. She wasn't suddenly treated like royalty. She wasn't suddenly respected. Instead, she became the target of quiet, constant mockery that followed her everywhere she went. Servants who once smiled at her now looked away when she passed. Nobles who once ignored her now stared with open judgment. Even the palace guards, who used to nod politely, now seemed unsure whether to treat her as a servant or as the future queen, and mostly chose to treat her as neither, just someone to be avoided. The worst moments came during formal events. At the equinox feast, held just weeks after the announcement, Wren sat at the head table beside Kael, dressed in a gown far too fine for someone who had spent her whole life cleaning floors. She could feel the tension in the room, thick as smoke. And then, when she looked down at her plate, she saw it. Someone had placed a scrub brush where her wine goblet should have been. The message was clear. Cruel, but clear. You don't belong here. You'll always just be the maid. The table went quiet, as people waited to see how she would react. Some looked ready to laugh outright. Others watched with something closer to pity. Wren looked at the brush for a long moment. Then calmly, she picked it up, turned it over in her hands as if inspecting it for quality, and set it down neatly beside her plate, bristles facing up. Then she picked up her spoon and continued eating, as if nothing had happened at all. The silence that followed was different this time. Not amused, not smug, just confused, because she hadn't reacted the way they wanted her to. No tears, no embarrassment, no storming out of the hall. Just quiet, steady calm. Kael, sitting beside her, saw everything. He said nothing about the brush in front of the court, but later that night, in the privacy of the corridor outside her room, he brought it up. "You didn't have to sit there and take that," he said. "I know," Wren replied simply. "You could have said something. I would have stood beside you. I know that too." She looked at him, her expression tired but steady. "But if I react to every little thing they throw at me, I'll spend the rest of my life reacting. I'd rather just keep living." Kael studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, not quite understanding yet, but respect, deep and growing. "They mock me too, you know, for choosing you. I know that as well. Does it bother you?" And Wren was quiet for a moment, staring down at her hands, hands that had scrubbed 1,000 floors and carried 1,000 buckets. "People fear what they don't understand," she said finally. "You can't force them to understand faster. All you can do is wait and let time show them the truth, whatever that truth turns out to be." Kael didn't have an answer for that. He simply nodded, and for the first time since the announcement, he felt a strange kind of certainty settle into his chest, not about the mockery ending, but about the fact that he had chosen correctly, no matter what anyone else thought. The weeks that followed were not easy for either of them. Wren continued facing quiet cruelty in 100 different forms, from missing invitations to important events, to servants who accidentally forgot to prepare her chambers properly, to nobles who spoke about her as if she wasn't standing right in front of them. She never fought back loudly. She never demanded respect. Instead, she simply kept going, day after day, showing up, doing what needed to be done, refusing to disappear even when it felt like everyone around her wanted her to. Kael, for his part, began to notice something interesting. The more the court mocked her, the more he found himself drawn to her strength. Not the flashy kind of strength that comes from winning battles or intimidating enemies, but the quiet, stubborn kind of strength that comes from getting back up every single day without making a scene about it. One evening, weeks after the scrub brush incident, Kael found Wren sitting alone in the castle library, a place she rarely visited because she had never been taught to read properly as a child. She was staring at a book, slowly tracing the letters with her finger, sounding out words under her breath. He sat down across from her without saying anything at first. "You're teaching yourself to read," he said eventually. She didn't look up. Someone has to teach the future queen, and it seems nobody else volunteered. There was no bitterness in her voice, just simple fact. Kael felt something tighten in his chest, something between guilt and admiration. "I could arrange a tutor for you," he offered. "I know you could." She finally looked up at him. "But I'd rather learn it myself. It means more that way." From that point forward, Kael began spending more time with her, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to. He would sit with her in the evenings while she practiced her letters, sometimes helping, sometimes just keeping her company in comfortable silence. Slowly, the walls the court had built around her began to crack, at least in his presence, though the rest of the castle remained just as unwelcoming as ever. Then came the night that changed everything. It happened without warning, the way real danger usually does. A group of rogue wolves, wolves without a pack, without loyalty, without rules, had been causing trouble along the eastern border for weeks. Small raids, stolen livestock, burned fields. Nothing the Ashveil pack couldn't normally handle with a bit of patrol and patience. But that night, they grew bold. They breached the eastern wall of the castle itself, something no one had expected them to attempt, let alone succeed at. The alarm horn sounded too late. By the time the guards mobilized, 3 of the rogue wolves had already broken through into the servants' quarters, the very wing where Wren's small room was located. Kael felt it before he heard the horn, a sharp, sudden pull deep in his chest, the kind of instinct that mates develop for each other, a warning that something was wrong with the person tied to your heart. He moved before he even fully understood why, shifting into his wolf form mid-stride, fur and fury replacing skin and calm in the span of a single breath. He was fast. He had always been fast, but even moving at full speed, he heard the second sound before he reached the corridor. It wasn't a scream, it was a roar, a deep, powerful roar that didn't match anything he had ever heard before, especially not from the direction of Wren's room. He rounded the corner into the servants' hallway and stopped dead in his tracks. One of the rogue wolves lay on the ground, unmoving. Standing over him, fur blazing gold in the moonlight, streaming through a broken window, stood a wolf unlike anything Kael had ever seen, larger than expected, powerful in a way that seemed to defy everything anyone had ever assumed about the unremarkable gray wolf that Wren was supposed to have. It was her. It had to be her. And yet it looked nothing like the wolf everyone had dismissed for years. The second rogue lunged at her without hesitation. She didn't back away. She met him head-on, a collision of teeth and force, and with a strength that seemed almost impossible for her size, she threw him bodily into the stone wall hard enough to crack the stone itself. The third rogue took one look at what had just happened to his companions and fled without a second thought, disappearing back through the broken wall section they had entered from. Kael arrived to find the corridor in ruins, splintered wood, cracked stone, and blood that, thankfully, wasn't hers. Standing in the middle of it all was Wren, breathing hard, her golden fur catching the moonlight like something out of an old legend nobody quite believed anymore. She shifted back into her human form, kneeling on the ground, one shoulder bleeding where a claw had caught her before she managed to fight back. Kael was at her side almost instantly, still catching his own breath from the shift. "You're bleeding," he said, though it wasn't at all what he meant to say. "I noticed," she replied, her voice tight with pain, but steady all the same. He pressed his hand against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding, though part of him was more focused on the frantic beat of her pulse under his palm than on anything else. "Golden," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Your wolf. It's gold." "Apparently," she said, wincing slightly. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know this would happen. I wasn't hiding anything. I genuinely had no idea." "I believe you," Kael said firmly. "Everyone else won't. They'll say I planned this somehow, that I've been hiding my true strength this whole time, playing weak on purpose. Then everyone else can find something better to do with their time," Kael said, his tone leaving no room for argument. That comment pulled a small, cracked laugh out of her, despite the pain and the shock of everything that had just happened. She looked down at her own hands as if seeing them for the first time, as if trying to understand how they belonged to the same body that had just thrown a grown wolf into a stone wall. Golden wolves were rare, so rare that most people in the pack had only heard stories about them, old tales passed down through generations, stories about bloodlines carrying hidden strength that only appeared under the right, sometimes tragic circumstances. Nobody in Wren's family line had shown that color in over 4 generations. The old stories said gold only returned when something the pack desperately needed had been buried too long under shame, neglect, or forgetting. Kael didn't explain any of that to her in the moment. There would be time for the history lessons later, time for the elder women of the pack to corner her with questions and explanations she probably wasn't ready for yet. Right now, there was only the corridor, the blood, and the fact that his hand still hadn't moved from her shoulder. "They called you unremarkable," he said quietly. "They called me a lot of things," Wren replied. "They were wrong about every single one of them." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached over with her uninjured hand and picked a splinter of broken wood out of his hair, the same practical focus she had once shown while inspecting the scrub brush left at her plate as an insult. "You'll want to fix that before morning," she said. "People are already going to be staring at both of us." "Let them stare," Kael said. "For once, they'll have something worth staring at." By the time the healers arrived to properly treat her shoulder, word of what had happened had already begun spreading through the castle like wildfire. The Maid, the Golden Wolf, the rogue wolves defeated by someone everyone had dismissed for years as weak and unremarkable. The next morning, the mockery that had followed Wren for months seemed to evaporate overnight, replaced by something entirely different, a mixture of shock, curiosity, and, for many, quiet embarrassment. Nobles who had once whispered cruel things behind her back now found themselves unable to meet her eyes. Servants who had ignored her now watched her pass with wide, uncertain stares, unsure how to treat someone who had just proven herself stronger than most of them combined. Word of the attack and her role in stopping it eventually reached the pack elders, the old wolves who kept the ancient stories and remembered the meaning behind things like golden fur. They requested an audience with her, eager to understand where such a rare bloodline trait had come from and what it might mean for the future of the pack. Wren, still healing from her injury, agreed to meet with them, though she made it clear she wasn't interested in being treated like some kind of prophecy fulfilled. She simply wanted to understand what had happened to her, and why. The eldest of the group, an elderly woman named Old Greta, who had served the pack for over 60 years, studied Wren carefully during their meeting. "Your bloodline," she said slowly, "carries a very old strength. It only surfaces in times of great need, or in people who have been overlooked and underestimated for far too long. The wolf inside you was always there. It simply waited for the right moment to show itself." "Why didn't it show itself sooner?" Wren asked. "Why did it wait until now?" Old Greta considered the question carefully. "Sometimes strength waits until it is truly needed, not just wanted. And sometimes it waits until the person carrying it finally believes they deserve to be seen." Wren thought about those words for a long time afterward. She thought about the years of scrubbing floors, of being ignored, of being told, directly and indirectly, that she wasn't worth anyone's attention. She thought about how she had learned, slowly, to stop expecting kindness and simply focus on doing what needed to be done, day after day, without complaint. Maybe old Greta was right. Maybe her wolf had waited, because she herself had needed time to grow into someone capable of carrying that kind of strength, without losing herself in the process. In the weeks that followed, life in the castle changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The mockery didn't disappear entirely. Old habits and old prejudices rarely vanish overnight. But it grew quieter, more hesitant, as if people were no longer entirely sure of themselves. The confidence that had allowed nobles to openly sneer at the Maid evaporated once that same Maid had proven capable of taking down 2 rogue wolves without breaking a sweat. More importantly, Wren herself began to change, not in her personality, which remained steady and humble, but in how she carried herself. She still worked hard. She still spoke kindly to the stable boy and the kitchen staff. But there was a new quiet confidence in the way she moved through the castle now, the confidence of someone who had stopped waiting for permission to take up space. Kael watched this transformation with quiet pride, though he was careful never to take credit for any of it. He knew the strength had always been hers. He had simply been lucky enough to see it before anyone else did. Their wedding, originally planned as a small, quiet affair given the court's disapproval, grew into something much larger once word spread of Wren's golden wolf and her role in defending the castle. Nobles who had once refused to acknowledge her now scrambled to be included on the guest list, eager to associate themselves with someone who had proven herself far more capable than any of them had given her credit for. Wren found the sudden change in attitude almost amusing, though she made sure not to let it go to her head. She remembered every single person who had mocked her, every servant who had looked away, every noble who had left a scrub brush at her plate as a cruel joke. She didn't seek revenge against any of them. She simply remembered, quietly, and let that memory guide her in how she chose to treat others going forward. On the day of the wedding, the castle was filled with more guests than it had seen in years. The same hall where Wren had once stood, staring at a water-stained ceiling while the court laughed behind their hands, was now decorated with gold and deep green banners, the colors chosen specifically to honor her wolf. Wren stood at the front of the hall, wearing a gown that had been carefully tailored to fit her properly this time, no longer borrowed, no longer ill-fitting. She looked out at the crowd, the same crowd that had mocked her just months before, and felt none of the fear she had once carried into that same room. Kael stood beside her, and when their vows were exchanged, his words were simple and direct, just like the man himself. I chose you before I knew what your wolf would become. I would choose you again, no matter what color it turned out to be. Your strength was never something you needed to prove to anyone. It was always there. I was simply fortunate enough to see it first. Wren's response was quieter, but no less powerful. They called me unremarkable for years. I believed it myself, for a while. But I've learned that the people who judge you fastest are usually the ones who understand you least. I don't need their approval anymore. I only ever needed to understand my own worth, and I finally do. The hall erupted into applause, genuine this time, not the polite hollow clapping of people going through the motions, but real recognition of someone who had earned her place through quiet strength, rather than birthright or bloodline politics. In the years that followed, Wren became known throughout the pack not just as the queen with the rare golden wolf, but as someone who used her position to help others who had once been overlooked the way she had been. She established programs within the castle to properly train young wolves regardless of their family background, insisting that talent and strength could come from anywhere, not just from noble bloodlines. She never forgot where she came from. She kept the old scrub brush, the very one that had been left at her plate as an insult, in a small box in her personal chambers, not as a reminder of pain, but as a reminder of how far she had come, and how much people can underestimate what they don't understand. Kael, for his part, never stopped being proud of his choice. Even as the years passed, and the memory of the court's mockery faded into an old story people barely remembered anymore. He often told anyone who would listen that the greatest decision he ever made as king wasn't a military strategy or a political alliance, but simply choosing to see someone the rest of the world had chosen to ignore. And every so often, late at night, when the castle was quiet and the halls were empty, Wren would walk through the same corridors she used to clean as a servant, tracing her fingers along familiar stone walls, remembering the girl who once hummed quietly to herself, never imagining that someone was listening, never imagining that her whole life was about to change because a king happened to notice a small, unremarkable moment and saw something worth paying attention to. The mockery that once followed her everywhere eventually became nothing more than a story people told to explain how wrong first impressions can be. And every time that story was told, it ended the same way, with a reminder that real strength doesn't always look the way people expect it to, and that the people who are underestimated the most sometimes turn out to be the ones who change everything.